Welcome back to Verified Souls, where the forest never really lets you leave. Tonight, we're heading deep into Coconino National Forest, an endless maze of pines, volcanic rock, and forgotten trails, where people swear time goes missing, voices learn your secrets, and something you can't quite see keeps stepping just out of frame. As you listen, pay attention to that feeling in your chest when a detail sounds a little too specific, a little too real, because once this episode gets under your skin, you might find yourself replaying it long after the screen goes dark, wondering how much of it is still out there, waiting. If you feel the forest watching you by the end of this video, prove you're one of the fearless. Mark your presence with a like, seal your name among the verified souls by subscribing, and drop a comment with the timestamp where the dread hit you hardest, so the others know exactly where to be afraid. The Mogollon Rim cuts across Arizona like a scar, 2,000 feet of sheer cliff face separating the high country from the desert below. In 1998, I worked maintenance for the Forest Service, which meant I spent most of my days alone on trails that hadn't seen another human in weeks. General Crook Trail was my route that morning. Simple job: check for washouts, clear fallen timber, make sure the trail markers were still standing. 2 hours, maybe 3 if I took my time. I left the ranger station at 9 in the morning with a full thermos of coffee, my logbook, and a radio that crackled with morning chatter from the other crews scattered across the district. I remember checking my watch when I reached the trailhead. 9:17. The ponderosa pines stretched up into a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the air had that clean, sharp smell it only gets at 7,000 feet. I locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking. That's the last clear memory I have of that morning, my boots hitting the trail, sunlight filtering through the canopy, the distant call of a Steller's jay somewhere in the trees. Everything after that is just gone. Not fuzzy, not dreamlike, just completely erased. Like someone took scissors to that section of my life and cut it clean out. But here's what I know happened, even though I can't remember any of it. I hiked that trail. I did my job. I filled out my inspection report in my own handwriting, documenting every mile marker, every drainage crossing, every spot where the trail needed work. The notes are detailed, precise, exactly the kind of thing I'd write after hours of careful observation. Except I don't remember writing a single word. When I came back to myself, I was standing at my truck. The driver's side door was open, and I had my keys in my hand like I'd just arrived. My watch read 9:47. I'd been gone 30 minutes, which was impossible because I was still holding my full thermos of coffee, the seal unbroken. I hadn't even taken a sip. I checked my pack, thinking maybe I'd forgotten something, and turned back early. But everything was there. Radio, first aid kit, trail markers, tools. Nothing missing, nothing out of place. That's when I noticed the radio. It was on, volume turned low, and I could hear dispatch coordinating crews for end-of-day check-ins. Someone was reporting they were heading back to the station after finishing their route. Normal conversation, except the voice said it was 6:14. 6:14 in the evening. I looked at my watch again. 9:47. I tapped it twice, thinking maybe it had stopped, but the second hand was moving just fine. I turned up the radio volume. Another voice confirmed. 6:16, heading in for the night. My stomach went cold. I grabbed the radio handset and called in. "This is Unit 7. Do you copy?" The response came back immediately. "Copy, Unit 7. We've been trying to reach you for the last 20 minutes. Where have you been?" I asked them what time it was. There was a pause, then, "It's 6:17. You okay out there?" I looked at my watch one more time. Still 9:47. Still running. Still wrong by almost 9 hours. I drove back to the station with my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. When I walked into the office, everyone turned to look at me like I'd just materialized out of thin air. The station clock read 6:23. My supervisor asked where I'd been, said I'd missed my noon check-in, my 3 o'clock check-in, everything. Said they'd been about to send someone looking for me. I told him I'd just gotten back, that it had only been an hour, maybe less. He stared at me for a long moment, then told me to sit down. That's when I pulled out my logbook. The inspection report was complete. 4 pages of notes, covering the entire 12-mile trail system, written in my handwriting, in my style, documenting conditions I had absolutely no memory of observing. I'd noted a fallen ponderosa at mile marker 3, recorded water levels at each of the creek crossings, even sketched a quick map showing where we'd need to reroute around a washout near mile 7. The notes were good, professional, thorough, exactly what they needed. But reading them felt like reading a stranger's diary. They sent me to the clinic in Flagstaff that night. The doctor ran every test she could think of: neurological exam, blood work, CT scan, the whole routine. Everything came back normal except one thing. I was severely dehydrated. The kind of dehydration you get after 8, maybe 10 hours of hard physical activity in dry climate without water. My electrolytes were shot. My muscles showed signs of sustained exertion. The doctor asked me if I'd been hiking all day, and when I said I didn't remember, she thought I was confused from dehydration. She kept me overnight, pumped me full of IV fluids, and told me I was lucky I hadn't collapsed. But it gets stranger. 3 days later, my supervisor called me into his office. He had a printout from the truck's maintenance log, something I'd never even thought about: the odometer. When I'd left that morning, the truck had shown 47,392 miles. When I got back that evening, it showed 47,456. 64 miles. The trailhead was 7 miles from the station, so round trip should have been 14 miles, maybe 15. Where did the other 50 miles go? My supervisor spread a map across his desk and asked me if I'd driven anywhere else that day, checked any other trails, made any detours. I couldn't answer him. I had no idea. Over the next few weeks, we started getting reports from hikers. Someone had found a Forest Service hard hat sitting in the middle of the trail near Barbershop Canyon, 14 miles from where I'd been working, in a completely different drainage system. The hat had my name written inside the brim. I'd been wearing it that morning. I know I was, because I remember adjusting it before I locked the truck, but I was still wearing it when I came back that evening. So how did my hat end up 14 miles away when I never took it off? Then the boot prints started showing up. A trail crew working the Pine Canyon route found fresh prints that matched Forest Service issue boots, size 11, same as mine. The prints were dated to that same day. You could tell from the way they overlay other tracks, from the condition of the disturbed soil. The prints went up the trail for 3 miles, then left the trail entirely and headed straight into the backcountry toward the rim. They followed them for another mile before losing them in the rocks. Nobody had been assigned to that trail. Nobody should have been out there. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. What keeps me awake even now, almost 30 years later. Those notes in my logbook, I've read them hundreds of times, and there are details in there that I would never have written, phrases that don't sound quite like me. On page 3, describing the forest around mile marker 8, I wrote, "Trees exhibiting unusual shadow patterns despite consistent sunlight. Shadows oriented northwest despite afternoon sun position. Possible surveying error?" And at the bottom of page 4, almost like an afterthought, ambient sound quality differs from standard conditions. Possible atmospheric inversion affecting acoustics. Trees appear to be breathing in synchronized patterns. Trees breathing. I would never write something like that. Not in an official inspection report. It sounds insane. But there it is, in my handwriting, in my logbook, describing something I have absolutely no memory of witnessing. I quit the Forest Service 8 months later. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't spend my days alone on those trails, wondering if it would happen again. Wondering what I was doing during those lost hours. Wondering what was doing things while wearing my face. I moved to Phoenix, got a job in an office, tried to forget about it. But here's why I'm telling you this now. 3 months ago, I got a voicemail on my cell phone. Wrong number, I figured, until I heard the voice. It was mine. My voice, my cadence, my speech patterns. The message said, Unit 7 reporting trail conditions for Barbershop Ridge. Significant deadfall at mile marker 4. Recommend closure until cleared. Strange activity near the overlook. Advise crews to avoid sunset hours. Will continue monitoring. Then, the message cut off. I haven't worked for the Forest Service since 1999. Barbershop Ridge isn't a trail I ever worked. And that voicemail? The metadata shows it was sent from a Forest Service radio frequency that's been decommissioned for 15 years. I've gotten 4 more messages since then. All from myself. all reporting trail conditions from places I've never been. The most recent one came last week. My voice said, "Don't try to find me. I'm still working the routes. I'll be done soon." I don't know who's leaving those messages. I don't know what happened to me on the Mogollon Rim that day in 1998. But somewhere in Coconino National Forest, something is still walking those trails, wearing my boots, doing my job, filing reports in my handwriting. And whatever it is, it's been doing it for 27 years. My watch still says 9:47. I've summited Humphreys Peak 11 times. At 12,633 feet, it's the highest point in Arizona, and if you time it right, leaving well before dawn, you can watch the sunrise from above the clouds. That's what I was going for in October 2003. I'd done this exact route half a dozen times before. Start at 2 in the morning, headlamp cutting through the darkness, reach the summit by 6, catch the light show, and be back down before the afternoon weather rolls in. Simple, safe, routine. The Coconino Peaks wilderness doesn't mess around. Above 11,000 feet, you're in alpine tundra, no trees, just rock and wind and sky. The air is so thin, your lungs burn with every breath, and when the wind kicks up, it hits you like a physical force. But that's part of the appeal. Up there, you're completely alone in a landscape that looks more like the surface of another planet than anything on Earth. I loved it. Past tense. Because after what happened that morning, I've never gone back. I left the trailhead at 2:30 a.m., under a sky so clear, you could see the Milky Way stretched out like a river of light. My headlamp beam swept across the trail, ahead familiar terrain, rocks I'd stepped over a dozen times before. The temperature was maybe 20 degrees, cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, but I was moving fast, generating heat, feeling good. By 4:15, I'd reached treeline. By 4:45, I was up in the tundra, picking my way across loose scree in the darkness. The wind starting to pick up like it always does up high. That's when I heard the singing. At first, I thought it was just the wind. You hear all kinds of sounds up there. The way air moves through rock formations, it can sound almost musical. But this was different. This had structure, melody, harmony, multiple voices layered over each other in a way that made my skin prickle, because it didn't sound like any human singing I'd ever heard. The pitches were wrong, too high, too low, overlapping in ways that shouldn't work but somehow did. And it was coming from multiple directions at once, echoing across the slope, impossible to pinpoint. I stopped walking. The moment I stopped, the singing stopped. Complete silence, except for the wind. I waited, listening, telling myself I was imagining things, that it was just exhaustion and altitude playing tricks on my ears. I started walking again. 3 steps later, the singing resumed. Closer this time, much closer. I spun around, sweeping my headlamp across the slope behind me. Nothing. Just rocks, and wind-scoured earth, and darkness, beyond the reach of my light. But I could feel it now, that animal awareness that something was watching me. You know that feeling. It's ancient, hardwired into your brainstem, and when it kicks in, every nerve in your body starts screaming at you to pay attention. I kept climbing. I don't know why. Maybe because turning back felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Maybe because I'd done this route so many times that my body just kept moving on autopilot. But with every step, the singing grew louder, more complex, more wrong. It sounded like a choir now, dozens of voices, but no one was breathing between phrases. The sound was continuous, endless, like it was being generated by something that didn't need air. At 11,200 feet, I saw the first figure. It was standing on a ridgeline about 200 yards to my right, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and thin in a way that looked skeletal, like something that had been stretched. The wind was howling up there, gusts that would knock a normal person off their feet. But this thing wasn't moving at all, perfectly still. Not swaying, not adjusting its balance, just standing there, like it was rooted to the rock. I stared at it for maybe 10 seconds, my headlamp beam not quite reaching that far, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I made myself turn away and keep climbing. Hiker, I told myself. Just another climber going for the summit. Except I knew that was a lie. Nobody climbs Humphreys Peak in the middle of the night alone. nobody stands on an exposed ridge in 40-mile-per-hour winds without moving. I climbed for another 15 minutes, the singing continuing in waves around me, and then I looked up again. There were 3 of them now. One behind me on the trail I just covered, maybe 100 yards back. One ahead of me and to the left, positioned on a small rise. And the original figure, still on the ridgeline, still motionless. They formed a triangle, and I was in the center. Here's what you need to understand. I'm an experienced climber. I've been in bad situations before, caught in lightning storms above tree line, dealt with altitude sickness, navigated whiteout conditions. I don't panic easily. But standing there at 11,800 feet, watching those 3 figures hold their positions in the howling wind, something inside me broke. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. And every instinct I had was telling me to get off that mountain immediately. I started moving faster, pushing toward the summit because it was closer than going back down. The singing changed pitch, became more urgent, more aggressive. And then I smelled it, this overwhelming stench of burning hair mixed with copper. So strong, it made me gag. The smell was coming from upwind, which meant it was coming from above me, from the direction I was heading. I stopped and turned on my headlamp's high beam, sweeping it across the slope ahead. All 3 figures were there now, repositioned. They'd moved without walking. I would have seen them, would have heard them on the loose rock. But somehow, they'd closed the distance, and now they were maybe 20 feet away, arranged in a line between me and the summit. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. They looked almost human. Almost. But the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, hanging down past their knees. Heads tilted at angles that would break a human neck. And they were wearing clothes, or something that looked like clothes, but the fabric seemed to move independent of the wind, rippling and flowing in ways that made my eyes hurt to watch. The figure in the center raised one of those 2 long arms and pointed directly at me. Not at the space around me, not in my general direction. At me specifically, like it was marking me, identifying me. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I could hear the rasp of my breath. Could hear the wind screaming across the rocks. And underneath all of that, I heard something else. Breathing. 3 sets of breath, perfectly synchronized, coming from those figures even though they hadn't moved, hadn't opened their mouths, hadn't shown any sign of being alive. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My body just turned and started moving. Abandoning the summit, abandoning everything. I ran down that mountain in total darkness, because I'd turned off my headlamp without thinking. Ran across scree fields, where one wrong step could send me tumbling down a 1,000-foot slope. Ran through terrain I could barely see, guided only by muscle memory and pure terror. I didn't stop for 2 hours. Didn't stop until I was below tree line, surrounded by ponderosa pines, back in a world that made sense. My lungs were burning, my legs were shaking, and I'd torn open both knees, falling on the rocks. But I was alive. I was off that mountain. I called search and rescue from the trailhead parking lot. Told them I'd had an accident. Left my pack up high. They retrieved it 3 weeks later, from where I dropped it at 11,800 feet. When they brought the pack to my house, I went through it carefully, methodically, checking to make sure everything was there. My water bottles, my first aid kit, my emergency gear, all present. And my camera. I'd forgotten about the camera. I'd been taking photos on the way up, documenting the climb like I always did. I charged the battery and started scrolling through the images. 83 photos from that morning. The first dozen were normal. Trailhead, pre-dawn darkness, my headlamp illuminating the path ahead. Then, the images from higher up, above treeline, the flash catching the stark landscape of the alpine tundra. I scrolled through them quickly, not really paying attention, until I reached the last one. Photo number 83. I don't remember taking it. The timestamp shows 4:52 a.m., right around when I first heard the singing. The image shows my face, filling the entire frame, taken from about 2 feet away. I'm looking directly at the camera with an expression I've never seen on my own face. Mouth slightly open, eyes wide, skin pale, even in the flash. It looks like a selfie, except the angle is wrong. The camera is positioned slightly above and to the left, like someone taller than me was holding it, looking down. And in the background, just visible over my left shoulder, there's something dark and massive. The flash didn't reach it fully, so it's mostly shadow. but you can see the outline. Something huge, standing directly behind me, close enough that it should have been touching me. Close enough that I should have felt it. The shape doesn't make sense, too tall, too angular, proportions that my brain refuses to process. I took that camera to 3 different photo analysis experts. All of them confirmed the same thing. No manipulation, no editing, no double exposure. The metadata is clean. Whatever was behind me in that photo was actually there when the shutter clicked. One of the experts, an older guy who'd worked with law enforcement for 30 years, stared at that image for a long time before handing the camera back to me. He said, "I don't know what that is, but I've never seen anything like it, and I hope I never do again." I still have the photo. I've thought about deleting it 1,000 times, but I can't bring myself to do it, because sometimes, late at night, I zoom in on that dark shape behind me, and I can almost make out details. What might be a face, or something like a face? What might be eyes, reflecting the camera flash with a color that doesn't exist in nature? And what might be a hand, or something with too many fingers reaching toward the side of my head? I haven't climbed Humphreys Peak since 2003. I haven't climbed anything in the Coconino Peaks wilderness, because now I know something is up there, something that stands in the wind without moving, something that sings in harmonies humans were never meant to hear, something that gets close enough to touch you and take your picture while you're looking the other way. And I know, with absolute certainty, that if I go back, it will be waiting for me. Because whatever was on that mountain 22 years ago, it knew my face. It photographed me. It marked me. And some nights, when the wind picks up and I'm trying to fall asleep, I swear I can still hear that singing, distant, harmonic, impossible, calling me back to finish the climb I started. We planned the trip for months. 3 days, 2 nights in the Fossil Springs Wilderness, one of those backcountry spots where you hike 4 miles just to reach water that's so clear you can see 30 feet down. My best friend and I had done dozens of trips like this. We had our system down, split the gear weight evenly, set up camp before dark, filter water from the creek, cook dinner over a portable stove. Easy. We'd been doing this since college, and in 10 years, we'd never had a single problem. We reached the camping area around 3 in the afternoon on a Friday in May 2011. The hike-in was perfect, warm but not hot. The trail well maintained, the sound of Fossil Creek getting louder as we descended into the canyon. We found a spot about 50 yards from the water, flat ground with good drainage, sheltered by cottonwoods. By 5 o'clock, we had both tents up, gear organized, and we were sitting on rocks by the creek with our boots off, letting the cold water run over our feet. My friend said he was going to filter water for dinner. We'd brought a gravity filter. You fill a bag, hang it from a tree, and let it drip through into clean bottles. Simple process, takes maybe 15 minutes if you're moving slow. He grabbed the empty bag and 2 bottles and headed upstream to a spot where the water pooled deep and clean. I stayed at camp, started organizing our food, getting the stove ready. The sun was still well above the canyon rim. We had hours of daylight left. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. I figured he'd gotten distracted. Maybe exploring upstream. Checking out the area. But at 45 minutes, I started getting annoyed. The water should have been done 20 minutes ago, and I was getting hungry. I walked upstream, following the creek bank, expecting to find him crouched by the water, maybe having trouble with the filter. The bag was hanging from a tree branch, right where he should have been. Still empty. The bottles were sitting on a rock, caps off, waiting to be filled. But he wasn't there. I called his name. No response. I called louder. Nothing but the sound of the creek and wind moving through the cottonwoods. I searched the immediate area, thinking maybe he'd gone into the bushes to relieve himself, but there was no sign of him. His footprints were visible in the soft soil near the water's edge. Coming up to the spot where he'd set down the bottles, then nothing. No prints leading away, no disturbed vegetation. It was like he'd simply vanished mid-task. By 6:30, I was genuinely worried. I'd searched a quarter-mile radius in every direction, calling his name until my throat was raw. Nothing. I hiked back to the trailhead, 2 hours round trip in fading light, hoping maybe he'd gotten turned around and headed out. His car was still there. Mine was still there. No note, no sign he'd been back. I reached the ranger station just after dark. The ranger on duty listened to my story, asked basic questions about when I'd last seen him, what he was wearing, whether he had any medical conditions. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "We'll begin search and rescue operations in 48 hours. I stared at him. 48 hours? He's been missing for 6 hours already. It'll be dark soon. We need to start looking now. The ranger's expression didn't change. That's the protocol for this area. We initiate search operations after the 48-hour window. That's insane, I said. The standard is immediate response. Every hour matters. You know that. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes, not quite sympathy, but something close to resignation. I understand your concern, but this is the protocol we follow for Fossil Springs. I can't deviate from it. I spent that night and the entire next day searching on my own. I covered every trail, every side canyon, every spot along the creek where he might have gotten hurt or confused. I found nothing. No footprints, no dropped gear, no sign he'd ever existed. On the second night, I went back to the ranger station and demanded to know why they weren't searching. Different ranger this time, older, and when I started pressing him about the 48-hour rule, something shifted in his expression. "How many people go missing in Fossil Springs?" I asked. "Be honest with me." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can't discuss specific incident numbers." "That means it's more than a couple," I said. "How many?" He looked at his computer screen, then back at me. "I really can't. I'm not leaving until you tell me something," I said. "Anything. My best friend is out there." He sighed, glanced at the door, like he was making sure no one was listening, then said quietly, "You're the 7th report in the last 22 months. That's all I can tell you. 7 people, 7 disappearances in less than 2 years from one wilderness area, and I'd never heard about it." I pulled out my phone and searched for missing persons cases in Fossil Springs. Found 2. Only 2 public reports, and both were from over 3 years ago. I showed him the search results. "Where are the others? Why aren't they reported?" He didn't answer. Just turned back to his computer and said, "Search and rescue will begin at 0600 tomorrow. That's all I can tell you." True to his word, the search started at dawn on Sunday, 51 hours after my friend disappeared. I joined the team, hiking back to our campsite with 3 rangers and a dog handler. The dog picked up a scent immediately, followed it upstream past where I'd found the empty filter bag, then deeper into terrain that was getting rougher, more overgrown. We hiked for 3 hours, the dog pulling hard on the leash, clearly tracking something. Then we came to a clearing, and I saw something that made no sense. The ground was covered in gear, backpacks, water bottles, camping equipment, all of it scattered in a perfect circle, maybe 20 feet in diameter. And in the center of that circle was my friend's pack. I recognized it immediately, the same pack that had been in his tent back at camp. Someone had torn it open. Contents were everywhere. Clothes, food bags, first aid kit, all of it spread out like someone had been searching for something. But what stopped me cold were the survey markers. They were half buried in the brush around the clearing. Weathered metal stakes with stamped dates. I pulled one up and read it. USGS Survey 1954. Another one. U.S. Geological Survey 1957. These markers were ancient, hidden way off any established trail, and there were dozens of them forming a grid pattern through the area. One of the rangers made a radio call I wasn't supposed to hear. He stepped away from the group, but I was close enough to catch pieces. Bound the site. Yes, the usual pattern. No, we'll need 2. Then he saw me listening and stopped talking. We found my friend 6 miles from camp, lying unconscious in a dry wash that shouldn't have been accessible without serious bushwhacking. No head injury, no broken bones, no sign of what had happened. The medics loaded him on a stretcher and hiked him out. He spent 3 days in the hospital. Every test came back normal except for one thing. His blood work showed a compound the lab couldn't identify. Organic material, they said, but not from any plant or animal in their database. They sent it to a larger facility for analysis. Results came back inconclusive. When he finally woke up fully, he had no memory of anything after walking to the creek to filter water. Just a complete blank, 51 hours gone, like they'd never happened. But he had dreams. Vivid, recurring nightmares about being in an underground room. Bright lights. People in protective suits standing over him. He described medical instruments, examination tables, the smell of disinfectant. The doctors called it confabulation, false memories created by trauma. But here's what they couldn't explain. The marks on his arms. Perfectly circular scars, maybe a quarter-inch in diameter, arranged in a line from wrist to elbow. 4 on each arm. The doctors had no explanation for them. They weren't there before he disappeared. There was no sign of infection, no indication of when or how they'd been made. They looked months old, despite appearing in a 48-hour window. I started digging after that. Filed a Freedom of Information Act request for missing persons data in Fossil Springs. It took 6 months, but I finally got a response: heavily redacted documents with most of the information blacked out. But what I could read was disturbing. References to ongoing geological monitoring, dating back to 1957, the same year as those survey markers. Mentions of containment protocols and acceptable loss parameters. One document, dated 1963, referenced continued cooperation with research teams, but didn't specify what kind of research or who was conducting it. I tried to follow up, sent more requests, made phone calls to the Forest Service asking for clarification. The responses were always the same: that information is classified for reasons of national security, or those records have been destroyed, or we have no information on that topic. But one ranger, someone who'd just retired after 30 years, agreed to meet me off the record. We sat in a coffee shop in Flagstaff, and he told me things he said he'd never told anyone. That there were places in Coconino National Forest that had arrangements dating back to the Cold War. That certain areas were monitored for reasons that had nothing to do with wildlife or recreation. That the 48-hour rule existed because they need time to finish their work before we can interfere. I asked him who they were. He shook his head. I don't know. I've never seen them. But I've seen enough aftermath to know something happens out there. And I've seen what happens to rangers who ask too many questions. They get reassigned. They lose their jobs. 3 guys I worked with retired early because they couldn't handle being part of the cover-up anymore. Before he left, he said one more thing. Your friend is lucky. Most of the time, when someone disappears in Fossil Springs for that long, they don't come back. And the ones who do come back, changed. Watch him. Check in with him regularly, because sometimes the side effects don't show up until later. I still talk to my friend every week. It's been 14 years, and he still has the dreams. They're getting more detailed, more specific. He's starting to remember things that he insists aren't memories from the dreams, that they're real memories from those missing hours. He remembers underground spaces, massive rooms carved into rock. He remembers being unable to move while something examined him. He remembers other people there, unconscious on tables nearby, some of them wearing clothes that looked decades out of date. Last month, he sent me a photo. He'd been cleaning out old boxes and found a jacket he'd worn on the trip, the jacket he'd been wearing when he disappeared. In the pocket was something he swears wasn't there before. A small plastic card, like a medical wristband, with a barcode and an 8-digit number. He took it to a barcode scanner at a store. The number that came up meant nothing to him. But when I searched that number online, I found it. A patient identification code format used by military hospitals in the 1960 seconds. I've thought about going back to Fossil Springs, thought about searching that area where we found the survey markers, seeing what else might be hidden out there. But every time I get close to making plans, I remember what that retired ranger said. Some things have agreements older than the Forest Service. Some things were there first, and the best we can do is stay out of their way. My friend still has those scars on his arms. Perfect circles, arranged in lines, like someone was marking injection sites or sampling points. When I asked him if he'd ever tried to find out what the substance in his blood was, he said the hospital lost the samples. All of them. Contaminated during storage, they claimed. Nothing left to test. But sometimes, late at night, he sends me messages. Says he can feel something in his blood. Something that wasn't there before. Something that moves. I prefer solo backpacking trips. Always have. There's something about being completely alone in the wilderness that clears your head in a way nothing else can. No conversation, no compromise on pace or destination, just you and the trail, and the silence. West Clear Creek Wilderness was perfect for that, remote enough that you could hike for days without seeing another person, beautiful enough that every bend in the canyon revealed something worth stopping for. I'd planned a 3-day route that would take me 8 miles into the canyon system, following the creek through narrow passages where the walls rose 300 feet on either side. I started the hike on a Thursday in September 2015, late enough in the season that most tourists were gone, but early enough that the weather was still mild. The descent into the canyon took most of the afternoon, the trail switching back and forth down the cliff face until I reached the creek bed. By 7:30, I'd found a good spot to camp, a flat area tucked against the canyon wall, sheltered from wind, close enough to the water that I could hear it moving over the rocks. I set up my tent, got my sleeping pad and bag arranged inside, and started working on dinner. The sun was already below the canyon rim, and the light was fading fast in that way it does in deep canyons, where twilight only lasts about 20 minutes before full darkness settles in. I had my headlamp ready, my stove hissing as it boiled water for my dehydrated meal, and I was feeling that particular kind of contentment you only get when you're exactly where you want to be. That's when I heard my name. Not a shout, not a call from a distance. My name spoken clearly, conversationally, like someone was standing just outside my circle of firelight, and it was my father's voice. The exact tone, the exact cadence, the specific way he'd always said my name, with a slight emphasis on the first syllable. My father, who died 3 years earlier from a heart attack in Michigan, 2,000 miles away from this canyon in Arizona. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, every muscle in my body locked. The voice came again. Come down to the water. I need to show you something. I want you to understand something. I'm a rational person. I have a degree in engineering. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena or any of that. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, hearing my dead father's voice coming from downstream, I felt something break inside my chest. Not fear, not yet. Something worse, hope. That impossible, irrational hope that maybe, somehow, he was really there. I stood up and took 3 steps toward the creek, before my rational brain caught up with my emotions and stopped me cold. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the voice came again, and this time it was closer. I've been waiting for you. Come see. I grabbed my headlamp and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the area downstream from my camp. Nothing. Just creek water moving over rocks, canyon walls rising into darkness, shadows that moved with my light. But I could still hear it, my father's voice, now coming from just beyond the reach of my headlamp beam, always just out of sight. It's important, the voice said. You need to see this before it's too late. I didn't go. I forced myself to walk back to my camp, to sit down, to turn off my headlamp and stove. I sat there in the darkness, with my heart hammering, telling myself it was auditory pareidolia, or echoes playing tricks, or exhaustion creating false patterns in the sound of the creek. The voice continued for another hour, sometimes my father, sometimes pausing mid-sentence, sometimes repeating phrases exactly the same way twice in a row, like a recording stuck in a loop. And then other voices joined. My grandmother, dead for 7 years, calling me the nickname she'd used when I was a child. A college roommate, not dead, alive and well in Texas, but speaking in a perfect imitation of his voice, asking me to come help him with something. And then, around midnight, I heard my own voice calling from downstream. That's when the fear really set in, because my voice was saying things I'd never said out loud, private thoughts, things I'd written in journals, things I'd thought but never spoken. My voice said, I know you blame yourself for what happened. Come down here and we'll talk about it. And then, I know what you did in college. I know what you're ashamed of. Come face it. I've never felt more violated in my life. It was like something was inside my head, reading my memories, pulling out my most private moments, and broadcasting them in my own voice. The canyon walls created echoes, so every sentence repeated 3 or 4 times, overlapping, creating a chorus of my own voice, telling me my own secrets. I stayed in my tent all night, sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, headlamp off because I was terrified of what I might see if I looked outside. The voices continued until about 3 in the morning, my father, my grandmother, my roommate, myself, all speaking in turn, or in unison. sometimes making sense, and sometimes just speaking gibberish or repeating single words over and over. And always, they were calling me toward the water. When dawn finally came and light started filtering into the canyon, the voices stopped. Complete silence, except for the creek and morning birds. I packed up my camp in 15 minutes, didn't even bother with breakfast, and started hiking out. I'd planned a 3-day trip. I was leaving after one night, and I didn't care. I was maybe 200 yards upstream from my campsite when I saw the footprints. They were in a patch of soft sand near the water's edge, clear as day in the morning light. Bare footprints, human-sized, but wrong. Each print had 6 toes. Not 5 toes and some kind of deformity, 6 distinct, evenly spaced toes, all the same size, arranged in a pattern that didn't match human anatomy. The prints circled my campsite. I followed them, my stomach getting tighter with each step. They came up from the creek bed, walked completely around my tent multiple times, came within inches of where I'd been sitting when I first heard the voices, then led back toward the water and downstream. I followed them, against every instinct telling me to leave. Because I needed to know. 50 yards downstream, the prints led to a narrow opening in the canyon wall. I'd walked past it the evening before without noticing it, just a crack in the rock, maybe 3 feet wide, that opened into darkness. I turned on my headlamp and looked inside. It was a cave, or a passage, leading back into the cliff. And just inside the entrance, scattered across the sandy floor, were dozens of objects. I knelt down and started cataloging what I was seeing. A wristwatch, the leather band cracked and brittle. A wedding ring, gold, with an inscription on the inside. A wallet, the leather almost completely deteriorated. Inside were credit cards and an ID expired in 1984. Another wallet, newer, ID showing expiration in 1987. A compass, a pocket knife, a set of keys on a ring shaped like a miniature horseshoe. A pair of glasses, prescription lenses, thick enough that whoever wore them had serious vision problems. There were maybe 30 items total, all personal effects, none of them newer than 1987, based on what I could date. And they were arranged in a pattern, not scattered randomly, but placed deliberately in concentric circles, like someone had been organizing them, displaying them. I took photos of everything with my phone, then backed out of the cave. My hands were shaking. I hiked the remaining 7 miles to the trailhead in maybe 3 hours, practically running the last section. At the ranger station, I told them what I'd found, gave them the exact location, showed them the photos. They said they'd send someone to investigate. 2 weeks later, I called to follow up. The ranger I spoke to said they'd searched the area thoroughly, found the cave entrance I'd described, but there was nothing inside. No personal effects, no objects, no footprints. Just an empty cave, maybe 20 feet deep, ending in a solid rock wall. I insisted I had photos. I pulled them up on my phone to check before I sent them. The photos were still there, but they'd changed. Every image of the items inside the cave now showed empty ground. Just sand and rock, no wallets, no watches, no glasses. The metadata showed they were the same photos I'd taken, same timestamp, same GPS coordinates, but the objects were gone. The ranger suggested maybe I'd been more exhausted than I realized, that the canyon can play tricks on your perception, especially if you're not sleeping well. But I know what I saw. I know what I photographed. And I know what I heard calling me toward that cave all night. 3 months later, I saw a news report about hikers in West Clear Creek Wilderness reporting strange voices near the water. They described hearing family members, friends, their own voices calling them from the canyon. Forest Service issued a statement saying it was likely auditory illusions caused by echo patterns and creek sounds, that the human brain is pattern-seeking and will sometimes create familiar voices out of random noise. But I joined a forum where people share experiences from Coconino National Forest, and I found 6 other accounts from West Clear Creek describing the same thing: voices of dead loved ones, voices of the hikers themselves saying things they'd never said out loud. And all of them mentioned being called toward the water, toward caves or passages in the canyon walls. One post, from a user who claimed to be a retired archaeologist, mentioned that the Sinagua people who lived in this region centuries ago had specific prohibitions about certain canyon areas. They believed some places were inhabited by beings that could steal voices, that could speak as the dead, that would lure people into underground spaces. the post said. They marked these places with warnings. Most of those markers are gone now, worn away by time. But the things they warned about are still there. I've tried to research it further, but there's not much information available. The Sinagua left this area around 1425 CE, and most of their knowledge was oral tradition that wasn't preserved. But I did find one academic paper that mentioned West Clear Creek specifically, noting that it was considered a boundary place, a threshold between the world of the living and something else. The paper didn't specify what that something else was. I'll never go back to West Clear Creek. Not for any amount of money, not for any reason. Because I know what's down there in those deep caves beneath the canyon floor. I know something lives in the darkness that can read your mind and speak your memories back to you in voices you trust with your life. Something that collects pieces of the people who come to it, not bodies, but belongings, identities, the small objects we carry that prove we existed. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I still hear my father's voice. It's distant, muffled, like it's coming from very far away. It says, "Come back, we're all waiting for you. Come see what we've become." I checked with my family. My father's grave in Michigan is undisturbed. His body is still there. But something in that canyon has his voice, and it has mine too. I left it there, echo trapped in stone, still calling, still waiting for someone to answer. The canyon is always hungry, and it's very, very patient. I was 17 in the summer of 1979, and my friends and I thought we were invincible in that way only teenagers can. We'd spend entire days exploring the forest around Mormon Lake, riding our bikes down fire roads, finding places adults had forgotten about or never knew existed in the first place. That's how we found the stairs completely by accident, hidden under years of deadfall and pine needles, in an area we must have ridden past 100 times before. It was late June, maybe 4 in the afternoon, and we were cutting through the forest, trying to find a shortcut back to the main road. One of my friends hit a route wrong and went down hard, his bike skidding sideways into what looked like a pile of old branches and debris. When we went to help him up, we saw it. A corner of concrete, perfectly geometric, too deliberate to be natural. We started clearing away the branches and pine needles, and within 20 minutes, we'd uncovered a set of concrete stairs descending into the ground. The stairs were maybe 4 feet wide, military-grade construction, leading down into complete darkness. At the top, partially buried, was a metal sign so rusted we could barely read it. U.S. Government property. No trespassing. Below that, stenciled numbers that might have been a facility designation, but they were too corroded to make out completely. We should have left. Every reasonable instinct should have told us to get back on our bikes and forget we'd ever seen it. But we were 17, and we just discovered something that looked like it came straight out of a spy movie. One of my friends had a flashlight on his bike. We made a plan. Just look inside, see what it is, be back out in 10 minutes. That's all. Just a quick look. The stairs went down about 20 feet, ending at a heavy steel door that was partially ajar. The hinges had rusted through, and the door sat at an angle, leaving just enough space for us to squeeze through one at a time. The air that came up from below was cold and stale, like opening a refrigerator that had been sealed for years. We should have recognized that as wrong. This was Arizona in June, and the temperature outside was pushing 90 degrees, but the air coming from underground felt like it was maybe 50. Inside was a corridor, concrete walls painted institutional green, with electrical conduits running along the ceiling. Some kind of military facility, we figured, probably from the Cold War era, abandoned and forgotten. The flashlight beam didn't reach very far, but we could see that the corridor opened into a larger room about 30 feet ahead. We walked slowly, our footsteps echoing in a way that made the space feel massive, and when we reached the room, we understood why. It was an observation center, or had been. The room was maybe 40 feet across, filled with desks arranged in rows, all of them facing one wall that was covered in screens, dozens of them. Old cathode ray monitors from the 60s or 70s, all different sizes. Filing cabinets lined the other walls. There were coffee mugs still sitting on desks, papers scattered around, a jacket hanging on the back of a chair. It looked like everyone had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. But here's what stopped us cold. The screens were on. Not all of them, but but maybe half of them were displaying live images, grainy, black and white, but definitely active. We stood there, staring, trying to process what we were seeing, because this place had clearly been abandoned for years. There were no power lines running to this location, no generator sounds, nothing that could explain why these screens were still functioning. My friend walked closer to get a better look, and that's when we realized what the screens were showing. They were surveillance feeds from the forest above, different locations, different angles, but all of them showing areas around Mormon Lake. One screen showed a section of fire road we'd ridden down that morning. Another showed the lake itself from an elevated angle. A third showed a clearing we recognized from previous trips. And then we saw our bikes. On one of the screens, clear as day, our 3 bikes leaning against a tree exactly where we'd left them, at the top of the stairs. The camera angle was from directly above, looking down, like the camera was mounted on something overhead. We all looked at each other, and I could see my own confusion and fear reflected in their faces. We'd been so focused on the stairs that we hadn't looked up, hadn't noticed if there was anything in the trees above us. One of my friends started going through the papers on the nearest desk. They were observation logs, handwritten entries dated from 1962 and 1963, documenting something called Project Watchfire. The entries were technical, clinical, noting dates and times and grid coordinates, along with brief descriptions. Anomaly observed grid 4, 2,340 hours. Duration, 14 minutes. Magnetic fluctuation recorded grid 7. Sustained pattern. Visual phenomenon confirmed by multiple observers. Origin point unmapped. The logs continued through 1,963, becoming more frequent and more detailed. Then, in September 1964, the entries changed. Someone had written in all caps, Grid 7, observation teams, overdue. And the next entry, second search party, no contact, 8 hours. And then, personnel rotation canceled effective immediately. And finally, the last entry, dated the 23rd of September 1964, recommend facility abandonment. Observation teams do not return from Grid 7. Whatever they were monitoring is now monitoring us. After that, the pages were blank, no more entries, like everyone had left in a hurry and never came back to close out the project properly. My friend kept flipping through papers, found maps of the forest divided into numbered grids, found technical reports with most of the content redacted in black marker, found Polaroid photographs paper-clipped to incident reports. The photos showed lights in the forest, not flashlights or campfires, but geometric patterns, bright points arranged in triangles or circles, hovering above the tree line. That's when we heard it. A mechanical clicking sound, coming from deeper in the facility, from a corridor we hadn't explored yet. It was rhythmic, regular, like machinery running on a cycle. Click whir, click whir, click whir. And underneath that, a low humming vibration you could feel through the floor more than hear. We walked toward it, I don't know why. We should have run. But there was something hypnotic about that sound, something that pulled you forward, even though your brain was screaming at you to leave. The corridor led to more rooms, what looked like living quarters, a kitchen area, a communications room filled with radio equipment that looked decades old, and at the end of the corridor, another steel door with a small window set at eye level. The clicking was coming from behind that door. My friend shined the flashlight through the window, and we all crowded around to look. Inside was another monitoring room, smaller than the first, but every screen in this room was active. And every screen was showing the same thing. The room we were standing in. The corridor behind us, looking through the window. But the angles were impossible. One screen showed us from behind, from back down the corridor, even though we'd just come from that direction, and there was nothing there. Another screen showed us from above, from a camera position that would have been inside the solid concrete ceiling. A third screen showed a close-up of our faces, pressed against the window glass, filmed from inside the room we were looking into, even though the room was empty. My friend reached for the door handle. I grabbed his arm and stopped him. Because I'd noticed something in the peripheral monitors, the ones not showing us. They were showing the forest above our bikes by the trees, the entrance to the stairs, and there was someone standing there. A figure in the grainy black and white image, standing next to our bikes, looking down toward the stairs. looking toward us. And then, on another monitor, I saw the same figure inside the facility, in the main observation room we'd just left, standing among the desks, facing the corridor we'd walked down. The timestamp on the screen showed the current time. This wasn't a recording. This was happening now. We ran. All three of us turned and sprinted back down the corridor, past the desks, past the filing cabinets, through the steel door, and up the concrete stairs. We hit sunlight, and kept running, grabbed our bikes, and didn't stop pedaling until we were back at the main road. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. We didn't make plans to go back. We just went home, and we never spoke about it again. Except, I couldn't let it go. For weeks, I'd ride my bike out to that area, trying to find the stairs again. I knew approximately where they were, could navigate to within 100 yards of the location, but I could never find them. The forest looked different somehow. The landmarks I'd used to orient myself weren't where I remembered, and that section of forest felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Like the trees were watching me. Like something knew I was looking and was making sure I couldn't find what I was searching for. 30 years later, in 2009, I went back. I was 48 years old, married with kids, and I'd never stopped wondering if it had really happened or if it was some kind of shared delusion we'd experienced. I brought equipment this time: GPS, metal detector, ground-penetrating radar I'd borrowed from a friend who did geological surveys. I had the coordinates from my memory, cross-referenced with old USGS maps. I spent 3 days searching that area. The metal detector picked up nothing. The ground-penetrating radar showed normal soil structure, no voids, no concrete, nothing to indicate any underground construction. The stairs were gone. Not buried, gone. Where they should have been was solid earth and trees that looked at least 60 years old, based on their size. Old-growth ponderosa pines with root systems that would have taken decades to establish. But the equipment I'd brought wasn't what convinced me I wasn't crazy. It was what I found in a declassified document archive at the library. I'd been searching for any reference to military installations near Mormon Lake, any Cold War projects that might have been in the area, and I found it. A single page from a 1,967 congressional budget document. One line item among thousands, easily overlooked. It referenced funding allocation for Project Watchfire, Coconino District, facility decommission, and remediation. The document confirmed the project existed, confirmed there had been a facility, but there was no detail about what it was monitoring, why it was abandoned, or what remediation meant in this context. I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for Project Watchfire documents, got back a letter saying no records exist for that project designation. I tried military archives, same response. It's like the project was scrubbed from every database, every file, every record. Except someone forgot about that one line item in a 1967 budget document. And someone didn't account for 3 teenagers stumbling onto something in 1979 that still had power, still had active cameras, still had screens showing feeds from locations that shouldn't have had cameras. I passed a polygraph test about the experience in 2010. The examiner said I showed no deception indicators when describing what we saw. That doesn't prove it happened, but it proves I believe it happened, which is something. I've tried to contact my friends from that day, but one moved out of state and won't return calls, and the other one agreed to meet me, but refused to discuss it. He said, "I've spent 40 years trying to forget that day. Please don't make me remember. But here's why I'm telling you this now. Last year, a hiker reported finding old concrete structures hidden in the forest near Mormon Lake. Posted about it on social media, included photos. The photos showed concrete corners poking through the soil, exactly like what we'd found. He said he was planning to come back with proper equipment to excavate and see what was there. He never posted again. His account went silent. And 3 months later, someone using a different name posted from the same area, saying they'd searched for the structures the first hiker had described but couldn't find anything. Just solid forest, old trees, no sign of any concrete. The screens are still on somewhere, the cameras are still watching, and whatever was in Grid 7 that made those observation teams disappear in 1964, it's still there, still monitoring, still making sure some things stay buried. I take a lot of photographs, It's become something of an obsession since I bought my first decent camera 5 years ago, landscape photography, mostly, and I've built a pretty substantial following online posting images from trails around Arizona. The Red Rock Secret Mountain Wilderness, near Sedona, has always been one of my favorite locations. The colors there are unreal. Rust-red cliffs against blue sky, green juniper scattered across the slopes, golden light that makes everything look like it's on fire during sunset hours. In April 2018, I did a solo day hike on Bear Sign Trail, planning to capture some images of the overlooks before the summer crowds arrived. It's a moderate trail, well-trafficked enough that you feel safe alone, but remote enough that you can find solitude if you time it right. I started early, around 7 in the morning, with my camera, a couple of lenses, tripod, and enough water and snacks for 6 or 7 hours out. The hike was perfect. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, and the light was exactly what I'd hoped for, that soft morning glow that makes the red rocks look almost luminous. I stopped every quarter mile or so to take photos, wide shots of the canyon systems, detail work on rock formations, a few compositions with juniper trees framing the distant cliffs. By noon, I'd taken maybe 40 images and was feeling really good about the shots I was getting. I made it to the main overlook around 1 in the afternoon, set up my tripod, and spent 20 minutes getting the composition exactly right. I wanted a panoramic view that captured the full sweep of the secret mountain wilderness stretching out to the north. I took several shots, bracketing the exposure to make sure I'd have options when I got home to edit. Then I packed up, had lunch sitting on the rocks, took a few more handheld shots of the scenery, and started the hike back to the trailhead. I got home around 6 that evening, downloaded all the images to my computer, and started the process I always follow. Sort through everything, delete the obvious failures, mark the keepers, and begin basic editing on the best ones. I was going through them chronologically, clicking through one after another, when I noticed something in the background of one of the early shots. It was an image I'd taken about a mile into the hike, a wide-angle shot showing the trail ahead with red rock cliffs on either side. And standing on the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead, was a person. They were facing away from the camera, wearing what looked like a red jacket and carrying a backpack. I didn't remember seeing anyone else on the trail that morning, but it's not unusual to cross paths with hikers and forget about it, especially when you're focused on photography. I kept clicking through the images. The next shot with a person in it was from about 2 miles in another wide-angle landscape with the figure visible in the background, a little closer this time, still facing away, still wearing red. And then another image, from 3 miles in, and another from 4 miles. In every photo where I'd captured enough background, the figure was there, progressively closer, always positioned just at the edge of the frame, always facing away from the camera. That's when I started to feel uncomfortable, because I definitely hadn't seen anyone following me. I'm observant on trails, especially when I'm alone, and I would have noticed someone consistently staying the same distance behind me for hours. I zoomed in on one of the clearer images, trying to get a better look at the person. The red jacket looked familiar. The backpack looked familiar. And then I realized why. They were identical to what I'd been wearing. Same shade of red. Same style of jacket. Same backpack model. I checked my closet to make sure, yes. Same jacket. Same pack. But the figure in the photos wasn't me. I was behind the camera. This was someone else. Someone who happened to be wearing exactly the same gear, hiking the same trail, staying just far enough behind me to appear in my background shots. I went through the rest of the images more carefully, examining every frame. The pattern continued all the way to the overlook. In the panoramic shots I'd taken from the summit, I could see the figure standing on the trail below, maybe 100 yards back, looking up toward where I'd set up my tripod. And in the last image I'd taken before starting back, a shot of the trail ahead, heading down there was the figure again, this time in front of me, heading down the same path I was about to take. I expanded the image to full resolution and zoomed in as far as the detail would allow. The figure's boots were the same model as mine, same brand, same color. The pants looked identical. The backpack had the same patches and straps. Everything matched. It was like looking at a photograph of myself from behind, except I knew with absolute certainty that I'd been alone on that trail. I started checking the metadata on the images, looking at the timestamps. Every photo was sequential, exactly where it should be, based on when I'd taken it. No gaps, no anomalies. And then I had an idea. I'd posted about the hike on social media before I went, and a few other photographers I know online had commented that they might be out there too. I reached out to two of them and asked if they'd been on Bear Sign Trail that day. Both confirmed they had. Both sent me their photos. And in their images, I found the same figure. A hiker from California sent me a shot from around 10 in the morning, different location on the trail, different perspective, but there in the background was the figure in red, facing away from his camera. Another photographer, someone local from Flagstaff, had images from around noon showing the figure in the distance. We'd all been on the same trail at different times, crossing paths without meeting, and we'd all photographed the same person. Except when we compared notes, we realized something disturbing. The figure was wearing different clothing in each person's photos. In my images, it wore red, matching my jacket. In the California photographer's images, it wore blue, the same color jacket he'd been wearing that day. In the Flagstaff photographer's images, it wore a dark green jacket, identical to hers. The figure was mimicking whoever was photographing it. The California photographer, curious and slightly freaked out, pulled up some images from a trail website where hikers could upload photos from Bear Sign Trail. He found dozens of images from different dates spanning the last 2 years, and in many of them, not all, but many, there was a figure in the background. Always alone, always facing away from the camera, always wearing clothing that matched the photographer's gear. Different people, different dates, same phenomenon. We created a shared folder and started collecting these images, organizing them by date. The pattern went back to at least 2016 based on what we could find. And in every case where we could contact the original photographer and ask them, the answer was the same. They didn't remember seeing anyone matching that description. They'd hiked alone or with friends and hadn't noticed anyone following them or staying consistently in frame. But here's where it gets worse. One of the photographers we contacted sent us a series of images from a hike he'd done on Bear Sign Trail in July 2017. He'd been hiking with his wife, and in several of his photos of the landscape, there was the figure in the background, wearing the same color jacket as him, same style backpack, same build. We asked if he remembered seeing this person. He said no. So we asked if we could see more of his photos from that day, especially any shots of his wife. He sent us about 20 images, and in one of them, taken at the overlook, there was a photo of his wife standing with her back to the camera, looking out at the view. It was a standard travel shot, the kind everyone takes. But when you zoomed in on the background, just barely visible on the trail below, there were two figures, both wearing the same color clothing he'd been wearing, both the same height and build, both facing away from the camera. He'd never noticed. Nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. But there it was, two copies of the shadow hiker, both in the same frame, both tracking him. I contacted the Forest Service and sent them everything we'd collected. They thanked me for the information and said they'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I got a generic response saying they'd investigated and found no evidence of any safety concerns on the trail. Standard bureaucratic brush-off. But 3 days after that, I got a private message from someone who claimed to work for the Forest Service, sent from an anonymous email account. The message said, "Stop looking into this. Stop collecting images. People who push this tend to have problems. The person in your photos isn't dangerous unless you go looking for them. They're just there. They've always been there. Leave it alone." I should have listened, but I didn't, because by that point, I'd found something else in my photos, something I'd missed during the first review. In one of the images from the overlook, I'd taken a shot of my camera bag sitting on the rocks next to my tripod. Just a quick documentation shot, the kind of thing you take to remember your setup. And in the reflection on my water bottle, barely visible, you could see the view behind me. There was someone standing there. Standing maybe 6 feet behind where I'd been setting up my camera, close enough that I should have heard them, should have sensed them. They were facing my direction, and even though the reflection was small and distorted, you could make out enough detail to see they were wearing red. I zoomed in on that reflection until the pixels started to break apart, and in that grainy, distorted image, I could just barely make out the figure's face. It was my face, staring at the back of my head, expressionless, close enough to touch me. I hiked Bear Sign Trail again 2 weeks later, in May 2018. I brought a friend this time, told him the whole story. Showed him the photos. We were going to figure this out. Document it properly. Maybe catch the figure in frame, and actually confront whoever or whatever it was. We hiked the same route I'd taken before, stopping at the same locations, taking photos constantly, including shots behind us, beside us, every angle we could think of. The figure appeared in our photos. In every single image where we captured enough background, there it was, sometimes far away, sometimes close, always just at the edge of the frame. My friend was wearing a yellow jacket that day. Distinctive, bright, impossible to miss. And the figure in the photos was wearing yellow. My shade of red was gone. It had changed to match him instead. We never saw it with our eyes, not once. We'd spin around trying to catch it, we'd set up cameras facing behind us on timers, we'd hide and wait to see if it would pass. Nothing. The trail stayed empty. But the photos showed it was there, following us, watching us, positioning itself in frame after frame after frame. At the overlook, we decided to try something. We set up 2 cameras on tripods, facing opposite directions, with synchronized timers set to take photos every 30 seconds. We walked away from the cameras and let them run for 10 minutes. When we came back and reviewed the images, we saw it. In the photos facing down the trail, the figure standing between the cameras, facing one camera, then the other, as they alternated shots. In the photos facing up the trail, the same figure, standing in a different position, closer to the cameras. It was impossible. The figure couldn't be in both sets of photos at the same time unless there were 2 of them, or unless it was moving faster than the camera cycle could catch, or unless it existed in some way that didn't follow normal rules about space and location. My friend deleted his photos after that trip and asked me never to contact him about it again. He said, "Whatever that thing is, it knows we're paying attention to it now, and I don't want to know what happens when it decides to stop hiding in the background. But I still check. I can't help it. I search for images from Bear Sign Trail posted by other hikers, and I zoom in on the backgrounds, and I find it. It's still there, still following, still mimicking, still positioning itself just out of sight but always in frame. And sometimes, in images posted in the last few months, I see something new. The figure is facing the camera now. In more and more photos, it's turned around, looking directly at whoever's photographing it. The face is still obscured somehow, always in shadow despite bright sunlight. Always just blurred enough that you can't make out features, but it's watching. It knows it's being photographed, and it's staring back. I haven't hiked Bear Sign Trail since that day in May 2018. But I still get notifications sometimes from my camera's cloud backup, telling me new photos are being uploaded to my account. Photos I didn't take. Images from Bear Sign Trail, from the same locations I photographed, from the same angles. The timestamps show they were taken at night, in complete darkness, but the images are perfectly exposed, perfectly focused, showing the empty trail under starlight. And in every single one, there's a figure standing exactly where I stood when I took my original photos, wearing red, facing the camera, getting closer with each image. The most recent photo uploaded 3 days ago. The figure is standing at the trailhead now, at the parking area, right where you'd park your car before starting the hike. It's not in the background anymore. It's not hiding at the edges. It's front and center, facing forward, waiting. And I know, with absolute certainty, that it's waiting for me to come back. I've been ranching in northern Arizona for 32 years. My family has held grazing permits in Coconino National Forest for 3 generations, running cattle across thousands of acres of high desert and pine country near Strawberry Crater. It's hard country, volcanic soil, sparse grass, predators that'll take a calf if you're not careful, but it's honest work, and I've never seen anything out here that couldn't be explained by nature, weather, or bad luck. Until May 2006, until I found my cattle arranged in a perfect circle around the crater, every single one of them dead, butchered with a precision that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I do a dawn check every morning during calving season, riding out on horseback or taking the truck to make sure the herd is healthy, accounted for, no injuries or breaches in the fence line. That morning, I left the house at 5:30, drove the service road out to the grazing area near the crater, and immediately knew something was wrong. The cattle should have been scattered across maybe 40 acres, grazing or bedding down. Instead, they were clustered in one location, and from a distance, they looked like they were sleeping in formation, which cattle don't do. They don't organize themselves geometrically. They don't sleep in patterns. I got closer and realized they weren't sleeping. 14 head of cattle, all dead, arranged in a circle roughly 60 feet in diameter with the crater at the center. They were positioned radially, like spokes on a wheel, each animal's head pointing outward, perfectly spaced. I've seen livestock kills before, mountain lions, coyotes, even the occasional bear, but this wasn't predation, this was arrangement. Something had positioned these animals deliberately, and they weren't just killed, they were opened up. I called the sheriff and the vet before I even got off the horse. Told them to get out here immediately because I had something I couldn't explain and needed documentation before anyone accused me of making it up. While I waited for them to arrive, I walked the perimeter of the circle, careful not to disturb anything. Each animal showed the same pattern of trauma. Eyes removed cleanly, tongue excised, reproductive organs taken with what looked like surgical precision. And there was no blood, none on the animals, none on the ground, none anywhere in the vicinity. Whatever did this had drained or removed several hundred gallons of blood without leaving a trace. The vet arrived first, and I watched his expression change from professional skepticism to genuine confusion as he examined the first animal. He took photos, measurements, tissue samples, then he moved to the second animal, and the third, and by the time he'd examined all 14, he was sweating despite the cool morning air. He said the cuts were too clean for any predator, too precise for any tool he was familiar with. The organs weren't torn out, they were excised with clean edges, almost cauterized, like they'd been removed with extreme heat or a laser. The sheriff showed up with 2 deputies around 7:30. They walked the scene, took their own photos, asked questions I couldn't answer. No tracks, no tire marks, no footprints human or animal. The volcanic soil around the crater is soft enough that it registers every step, every weight that passes over it. But the area around my dead cattle was completely undisturbed. Whatever killed them didn't walk there, didn't drive there, left no physical evidence of approach or departure. One of the deputies noticed something I'd missed. He pointed to the ground inside the circle. At the center point, equidistant from all the cattle, there was a symbol burned into the volcanic rock, not carved, not painted, but burned, like someone had taken a welding torch to the stone. Except the mark was a foot across and perfectly uniform in depth. It looked almost like coordinates, a series of numbers and marks I didn't recognize, precise and deliberate. The sheriff made some calls. By noon, we had Forest Service personnel out there, and by 2 in the afternoon, there were people in unmarked vehicles taking samples and measurements, people who didn't identify themselves or explain why they were involved. One of them, a woman in her 50s wearing civilian clothes, spent 20 minutes examining the burn mark at the center of the circle. She took photos from multiple angles, used some kind of handheld device to scan it, and then made a phone call where she spoke too quietly for me to hear. When she finished, she came over to me and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to this. Strange lights, unusual animal behavior, equipment malfunctions. I told her no, everything had been normal. She asked if I'd heard anything during the night, any sounds from the herd, any indication of distress. I told her my ranch is 3 miles from this location, and I sleep like the dead. I wouldn't have heard anything. She nodded, wrote something in a notebook, and then said something I'll never forget. This area has experienced similar incidents before. We recommend you consider relocating your grazing permits to a different section of forest. I asked her what she meant by similar incidents. She didn't answer, just said I'd be compensated for the livestock loss through standard channels and walked back to her vehicle. The vet's report came back 2 weeks later. Cause of death: extreme trauma from organ removal performed while animals were still alive. Method: unknown. Cuts showed evidence of heat exposure in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, applied with precision to biological tissue without burning surrounding areas, which shouldn't be possible with any tool or technique he was aware of. Time of death: all 14 animals died within a 3-minute window between 2:45 and 2:48 a.m., based on tissue deterioration rates. 3 minutes. Someone or something had killed 14 cattle, drained them of blood, removed specific organs with surgical precision, and arranged them in a perfect circle in 3 minutes. And they'd done it without leaving tracks, without making sound, without any evidence of their presence beyond the corpses and that burned symbol. I installed motion-activated cameras around the grazing areas after that. Invested in equipment that monitors electromagnetic fields, because I'd read that sometimes gets disrupted during unexplained events. And I started checking the Forest Service seismic monitoring station that sits about 2 miles from the crater. It's automated, records, ground vibrations, and magnetic fluctuations, and the data is publicly accessible online. I pulled the readings from the night my cattle died. At 2:47 a.m., right in the middle of that 3-minute window, the seismic station recorded a massive magnetic anomaly, fluctuations that spiked to levels the system flagged as equipment malfunction. The reading lasted exactly 140 seconds, 2 minutes and 20 seconds of magnetic chaos, and then everything returned to normal baseline readings. 3 days after I installed the cameras, I found a message. Not a note, not a phone call. A message burned into the grass inside the circle where my cattle had died. The grass was dead in a pattern that spelled out coordinates. I'm not military, don't have surveying experience, but I recognize the format from GPS units. I plugged the coordinates into my phone. They pointed to a location 2.3 miles deeper into the Strawberry Crater wilderness, in an area with no trails, no roads, no reason for anyone to go there. I should have reported it, should have called the sheriff, called those unmarked vehicle people, called someone with authority and training. Instead, I took my rifle, a GPS unit, and hiked out there alone. Took most of the morning to reach the coordinates, bushwhacking through terrain that fought me every step. But I found the location, and I found what was there. A depression in the volcanic rock, perfectly circular, 8 feet across, with sides so smooth they reflected sunlight like polished glass. The rock around it showed melting patterns, not cracking or fracturing like you'd get from natural volcanic activity, but melting, like something incredibly hot had rested there long enough to turn stone into liquid and then let it cool. At the center of the depression was a pile of organic matter, decomposed beyond recognition, but there was enough mass there to account for several large animals. I took photos and samples, scraping some of the organic material into a bag with gloves on. Then I noticed something at the edge of the depression. A bone, mostly clean, distinctly humanoid. I've seen enough skeletal remains from ranch accidents and hunting incidents to recognize a human femur. I marked the location, hiked back out, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. They sent a team out the next day. I led them to the coordinates, showed them the depression, showed them where I'd found the bone. They spent 4 hours searching the site, collecting samples, documenting everything. The organic material was sent to a lab for DNA analysis. The bone was sent to the state medical examiner. Results came back 3 weeks later. The organic matter contained DNA from multiple species: cattle, coyote, elk, and human. The human DNA was run through missing persons databases and got a hit. A hiker who disappeared from Coconino National Forest in September 1991, 15 years earlier, on a solo trip that was supposed to be 3 days. Search and rescue had looked for 2 weeks and found nothing. Now we knew where he'd ended up. The sheriff filed a report, classified my property as a crime scene, and said they'd continue investigating. But then something strange happened. 2 days after the DNA results came back, I got a visit from federal agents. They showed credentials identifying them as Department of Interior, said they were taking over the investigation due to the incident occurring on federal land, and that I should cease any independent inquiry into the matter. I asked them what they thought had happened out there. One of them looked me in the eye and said, "We believe this is related to illegal research activities that were conducted in this area during the Cold War. We're working to identify and remediate any remaining hazards." Then he handed me a card with a phone number and said, "If you observe any unusual activity, lights, sounds, equipment malfunctions, call this number immediately. Do not investigate on your own." I sold my grazing permits 6 months later. New permit holder took over the same areas, moved his herd out to Strawberry Crater. I called him 3 months in to see how things were going. He said fine, no problems, cattle were healthy. I called again at 6 months. No answer. Left messages. Nothing. I drove out to his ranch. Place was empty, house locked up, vehicles gone, no forwarding address left with the neighbors. I contacted the Forest Service to ask about the grazing permits. They said the permits had been voluntarily surrendered, and the area was now closed to livestock operations indefinitely due to ecological restoration priorities. I've driven past the Strawberry Crater area maybe a dozen times since then. Never stop, never get out, just drive past and look. And 6 times out of those dozen, I've seen lights. Not headlights, not campfires. Geometric patterns, triangles and circles of bright white light hovering above the crater, moving in coordinated formations, silent and wrong, in a way that makes your gut clench even from 3 miles away. Last month, I got a call from a journalist working on a story about unexplained cattle mutilations in the Southwest. Said she'd obtained some documents through a FOIA request and found references to my case. Asked if I'd be willing to talk about what happened. I told her everything I've told you. She said she'd found 23 similar incidents across Arizona and New Mexico between 1987 and 2018. All with the same pattern. Surgical precision. Missing organs. No blood. Magnetic anomalies recorded at nearby monitoring stations. She said she'd submitted her article to 3 different publications. All 3 rejected it. One editor told her off the record, "We received a call from someone asking us not to run this story. We don't know who called, but they knew details about the story that we hadn't published yet. That means they're monitoring communications. We can't publish something when we don't know who's watching." She asked me if I'd be willing to go on record using my name. I told her no, because 2 weeks after those federal agents visited me in 2006, someone broke into my house while I was out checking fences. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged. But every photo I'd taken of the cattle, every sample I'd collected, every document related to the incident, all of it was gone. Taken from a locked filing cabinet in my office, and whoever took it disabled my security system without triggering any alarms. The cameras I installed after the incident, they recorded lights over the crater 6 times in 8 months, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always the same geometric patterns, and then the cameras stopped working. All of them, on the same night, despite being different brands with different power sources. When I had them examined by a technician, he said they showed signs of exposure to electromagnetic pulses strong enough to fry the circuits. I'm telling you this now because I'm 71 years old, and I don't have much time left to care about consequences. Something is operating in the Strawberry Crater wilderness. Something that takes specimens, animal and human, and processes them in ways we don't have technology to replicate. Something that leaves evidence of its presence, but is protected by people with enough authority to make that evidence disappear. And it's still there, still operating, still taking what it needs. The lights still appear over the crater on clear nights. The Forest Service still maintains monitoring equipment in areas that supposedly have no special significance. And every few years, another hiker goes missing in that region, another case that gets searched for a week and then quietly filed away when nothing is found. 3 weeks ago, I got a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a photo. One of the photos I took of my dead cattle in 2006. A photo that was stolen from my house 18 years ago. On the back, someone had written, "We're still watching, keep quiet." I'm not keeping quiet anymore, because silence is consent, and I can't consent to whatever's happening out there in the darkness, under the lights, in the places where our technology fails and our explanations run out. Something has an agreement with someone. Something is being allowed to continue. And the cost is measured in blood and bones and questions that never get answered. If you go near Strawberry Crater, stay in your vehicle. Don't investigate lights. Don't approach areas that feel wrong. And if you see geometric patterns in the sky, triangles, circles, formations that move with purpose, drive away fast and don't look back. Because whatever's up there is watching. And it's been collecting specimens for a very long time. I've been technical canyoneering for 8 years, which means I'm comfortable with ropes, rappels, and descending into places most people will never see. Sycamore Canyon Wilderness is one of those places, a massive canyon system cutting through Coconino Forest with walls that rise 300 feet in some sections, and water-carved passages that twist through stone like the arteries of some enormous sleeping creature. I'd done preliminary research on a new route through the eastern section, studying topographic maps and geological surveys, planning a descent that would take me into areas that hadn't been documented in any trip reports I could find. The route started at a rim access point I'd scouted 2 weeks earlier, dropping 200 feet down a technical rappel into the main canyon. From there, I planned to follow the drainage downstream, documenting the terrain and looking for interesting features, slots, pour-offs, geological formations worth photographing. It was supposed to be a straightforward day trip, 6 hours down and back, with enough time built in for exploration and route finding. The descent went perfectly. I rigged my rope to a solid anchor, rappelled down the cliff face, and found myself in a section of canyon that was exactly what I'd hoped for. Narrow walls, sculpted sandstone, water-polished rock that showed the passage of thousands of years of flash floods. I started working my way downstream, climbing over boulders, squeezing through tight passages, documenting everything with my camera and GPS. About 2 hours in, at roughly 200 feet below the rim, I noticed something that wasn't on any of my maps. A crack in the canyon wall, maybe 4 feet wide at the opening. That didn't look like natural erosion. The edges were too regular, too straight, and when I shined my headlamp inside, I could see the passage continued back into the cliff face, rather than dead-ending after a few feet like most side features do. I'm curious by nature, maybe too curious, and I'd come down here specifically to find things that weren't documented. So I squeezed through the opening and started following the passage inward. It descended at about a 45-degree angle, and within 50 feet, the natural light from the canyon was completely gone. Just my headlamp beam cutting through absolute darkness, showing walls that were too smooth, too geometrically precise to be entirely natural. The temperature started dropping immediately. Outside in the canyon, it had been maybe 75 degrees, comfortable hiking weather. But 20 feet into this passage, I could see my breath condensing in the headlamp beam, and within another 100 feet, the cold was biting through my layers. I checked my thermometer, 48 degrees and falling. That's a 25-degree drop in less than 2 minutes of descent, which doesn't happen in natural cave systems unless you're descending very rapidly into deep earth. I should have turned back. Every rational part of my brain was saying, this doesn't make sense, this isn't right, document what you found, and come back with proper equipment and support. But the passage kept going, kept descending, and I could see that the walls showed marks parallel, grooves running along the sides that looked almost like tool marks, like something had carved this tunnel through solid rock. At 400 feet of descent, maybe 15 minutes into the passage, it opened into a chamber. And when I say chamber, I don't mean a small cave room. I mean a space so large, my headlamp beam didn't reach the walls in any direction. I stood at the entrance, shining my light around, trying to get a sense of the scale, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This chamber was the size of a cathedral, maybe bigger, hidden 400 feet below the surface of Sycamore Canyon, in an area that geological surveys showed as solid bedrock. I walked into the space, and my footsteps echoed back to me, with a delay that suggested the chamber was at least 200 feet across. The floor was covered in fragments of bone, thousands of pieces, ranging from tiny shards to intact ribs and skulls, scattered across the stone like gravel. I knelt down and examined them with my light. Animal bones mostly, species I recognized, elk, deer, coyote, but mixed in were bones I didn't recognize. Proportions that seemed wrong. Skulls with eye sockets positioned at angles that didn't match any anatomy I was familiar with. And then I found human remains. A skull? Unmistakably human, with a distinctive rounded cranium and forward-facing eye sockets. I picked it up carefully, and immediately felt the weight was wrong, too light, almost hollow. I turned it over and saw that the back of the skull had been opened, not cracked or broken, but cut with precision. A circular section removed cleanly like someone performing surgery. I found more human bones as I moved through the chamber. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all showing the same characteristics, too light. Sections, removed with surgical precision, arranged in small piles like they'd been sorted and examined. I stopped counting after I found the remains of what must have been at least a dozen individuals, possibly more, scattered across the chamber floor in various states of fragmentation. My headlamp beam caught something on the far side of the chamber, 6 openings in the wall, evenly spaced, each one leading to a tunnel that descended even deeper into the earth. I walked to the nearest one and shined my light down the passage. It dropped away at a steep angle, the walls showing the same too smooth quality, the same parallel grooves, descending into darkness that my light couldn't penetrate. And that's when I heard it. A grinding sound. deep and resonant, coming from one of the lower tunnels. Not the sound of rock settling or water moving through stone. This was mechanical, rhythmic, the sound of massive machinery operating at a distance. I stood there listening, trying to identify the source, and felt vibration through the stone beneath my feet, a low-frequency pulse that matched the rhythm of the grinding sound. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees in the span of maybe 30 seconds. I watched my breath cloud out in thick plumes, felt the cold biting into my face and hands, and that's when my rational brain finally overrode my curiosity and started screaming at me to leave. Because the grinding sound was getting louder, which meant whatever was making it was either getting closer or increasing in intensity. And the vibration through the floor was getting stronger, regular pulses that made the bone fragments around my feet jump and rattle with each wave. I turned and ran, sprinted back across the chamber floor, scrambled over the bone piles, and reached the passage I'd descended through. The climb back up was brutal, 400 feet of steep angle, loose rock, and absolute terror that something was coming up behind me. I could still hear that grinding sound, echoing up through the chamber, and underneath it, I heard something else. Something moving, something large displacing air in the tunnels below, creating pressure changes I could feel in my ears. I climbed until my legs were screaming, until my lungs were burning from cold air and exertion, until I saw the crack of natural light ahead that marked the canyon opening. I squeezed through and collapsed on the canyon floor, gasping, shaking, my hands torn from grabbing rock without thinking about technique or safety, and the grinding sound stopped. Complete silence from the passage behind me, like whatever had been operating in those deep spaces, had detected my exit and simply shut down. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd found, trying to decide what to do next. The rational thing would be to report it, call the Forest Service, tell them there's a massive cave system under Sycamore Canyon that's not on any maps, tell them there are human remains down there that need to be recovered and identified. But even as I thought through the process, I knew how it would sound. How could I explain a chamber the size of a cathedral that geological surveys showed shouldn't exist? How could I explain tunnels that descended to depths that would require major excavation equipment to create? I marked the location on my GPS, took photos of the opening from multiple angles, and hiked out. The climb back to the rim took 3 hours, and by the time I reached my truck, it was getting dark. I drove straight to the Forest Service ranger station and asked to speak to someone about a cave system I'd found. The ranger on duty listened to my description, looked at my GPS coordinates, and pulled up geological survey maps on his computer. "There are no caves in that location," he said, pointing to the screen. "Survey data shows solid basalt for 2,000 feet in all directions from those coordinates. Are you sure about your GPS reading?" I showed him the photos. He looked at them, zoomed in on the images, and frowned. "This looks like a crack in the canyon wall. Probably goes back a few feet and dead ends. Canyon systems have lots of these features." "I descended 400 feet, I said, "found a chamber with human remains. This needs to be investigated." He wrote down the information, said they'd send someone to check it out, and asked for my contact information. I gave him my number and email, told him I'd be happy to guide a team to the location, and left feeling like I'd done the right thing, even if he clearly didn't believe the scale of what I'd described. 3 days later, I got a call from a different ranger. Someone from the Wilderness Management Office. She said they'd sent a team to investigate the location I'd reported. They found the crack in the canyon wall, confirmed it was there, but initial investigation showed it was a shallow feature, extending maybe 30 feet before narrowing to impassable width. No chamber, no tunnels, no remains. I insisted that couldn't be right. Offered to guide them personally, to show them exactly where I'd gone. She said they'd appreciate that, and scheduled a follow-up investigation for the following week. I met them at the canyon rim, 2 rangers, and a geological surveyor with ground-penetrating radar equipment. We descended into the canyon together, and I led them directly to the crack I'd entered. Except it wasn't the same. The opening was there, in the right location according to my GPS, but it was smaller, maybe 2 feet wide instead of 4. I squeezed through anyway, certain that once we got inside, they'd see what I'd seen. But the passage only went back 20 feet before narrowing to a width I couldn't fit through. No descent, no smooth walls, no chamber. Just a dead-end crack in the canyon wall, exactly like the ranger had described. I stood there, staring at solid rock where there should have been open passage, and I could feel the rangers exchanging glances behind me. The surveyor set up his radar equipment and scanned the wall. Solid basalt, no voids, no cavities, no indication of open space beyond what we could see. I showed them my photos again, the images of the passage descending, the chamber, the bones. They looked at the photos, looked at the wall, and I could see them reaching the conclusion that I'd either fabricated the images or experienced some kind of psychological episode. We hiked back out without finding anything. The rangers filed a report stating they'd investigated my claim and found no evidence of the described features. Suggested I might have been disoriented from dehydration or altitude, that canyon environments can create perceptual distortions. I was polite, thanked them for their time, and left knowing they thought I was either a liar or delusional. But I know what I saw. I know what I climbed through. And I know that chamber exists somewhere beneath Sycamore Canyon, even if I can't prove it and can't access it. So I brought better equipment. Came back 6 weeks later with ground-penetrating radar I'd borrowed from a friend who does geological surveys, set it up at the canyon rim directly above where the chamber should be, and ran a deep scan. The equipment showed it. 600 feet below the surface, a massive void space in the bedrock irregular shape, roughly circular, diameter somewhere between 100 and 200 feet based on the radar return, and below that void, multiple linear features, descending even deeper. Tunnels or shafts dropping to depths the equipment couldn't measure accurately. The void was there. The tunnels were there. Everything I described existed exactly where I said it did. But there was no entrance. The crack in the canyon wall that I'd used to access the chamber was gone, replaced by solid rock that radar confirmed had no openings or passages. The chamber was sealed, inaccessible, and according to every instrument I had, it shouldn't exist in the first place. I submitted the radar data to the Forest Service with a formal request for investigation. Got back a letter 3 months later stating that the data had been reviewed by their geological team and attributed to instrument artifact or misinterpretation of subsurface anomalies. They thanked me for my concern, but stated that no further action would be taken. I posted about it online, in canyoneering forums and cave exploration communities, looking for anyone who'd experienced something similar. Got 2 responses that made my blood run cold. One from a caver in New Mexico who'd found a similar chamber system under Carlsbad area backcountry, massive spaces showing evidence of excavation, bone deposits, tunnels descending to impossible depths. He'd reported it, been told it didn't exist, went back with equipment, and found the entrance sealed. Second response from a climber in Utah who'd accessed a cave system in Canyonlands that matched the same pattern, too large, too deep, showing signs of machinery, filled with sordid remains. She'd photographed everything, submitted reports, and been told the cave didn't exist on any geological surveys. Both of them mentioned the same thing. Seismic sensors in the areas where they'd found the chambers recorded ongoing activity, movement in the deep earth, vibrations that matched industrial machinery, despite no mining or drilling operations being active in those regions. I still check the seismic data for Sycamore Canyon. It's publicly available through the USGS monitoring network, and I've been watching it for 2 years now. There's activity, regular pulses of seismic movement originating from approximately 600 feet below the surface, in the exact location where my radar showed the chamber. The pattern is consistent with heavy machinery operating on a cycle: 3 hours of activity, 2 hours of silence, 3 hours of activity. It's been running that pattern for 2 years, without stopping. Something is down there. Something is operating in spaces that officially don't exist, in chambers that can be sealed and reopened, in tunnels that descend to depths we're not supposed to know about. And whatever it's doing with the bones, with the remains of animals and humans that disappear into those deep places, it's been doing it for long enough that the deposits fill cathedral-sized chambers. I'm not going back. Not after what I heard in those tunnels. Not after feeling something massive moving in the darkness below. But I watched the seismic data, and I know it's still there. Still grinding, still operating, still collecting. And some nights, I dream about what's at the bottom of those tunnels. What's making that sound? What needs cathedral-sized chambers full of sordid bones? The dreams always end the same way, standing at the edge of a shaft descending into absolute darkness, hearing machinery echoing up from below, and knowing with complete certainty that if I descended far enough, I'd find something that would make me understand why the chambers exist, why the entrances seal, why the official reports say there's nothing there. But I'd never come back up to tell anyone what I'd found. I'm a photographer, mostly landscapes and architecture, and I take my family on trips specifically planned around getting good shots. In March 2020, just before everything shut down for the pandemic, we visited Walnut Canyon National Monument near Flagstaff, an area where ancient cliff dwellings from the Sinagua people are preserved in the canyon walls. These structures date back to the 1100s, stone rooms built into natural alcoves in the limestone cliffs, and they're accessible via a paved trail that winds down into the canyon. My wife and 2 kids were with me, and we'd planned to spend the afternoon walking the island trail, a mile-long loop that takes you past 25 cliff dwelling rooms. It was a beautiful day, clear skies, temperature in the 60s, and the canyon was relatively empty, maybe a dozen other visitors spread out along the trail. Perfect conditions for photography, without crowds ruining the shots. I was using a wide-angle lens to capture the dwellings in context with the canyon landscape, trying to show the scale and position of these ancient structures against the modern trail and visitors. About halfway through the loop, we stopped at a particularly well-preserved dwelling, a room built back into an alcove, about 15 feet deep, with the original stone walls still standing, and clear evidence of how the space had been partitioned for living areas. The dwelling appeared empty, as they all do. These rooms haven't been occupied for 800 years, and park regulations prohibit anyone from entering them. They're roped off, preserved for observation only. I positioned my family on the trail for scale, framed the shot to include the dwelling and the canyon beyond, and took several photos. Through the viewfinder, the dwelling alcove looked exactly as it should: empty stone room, dirt floor, shadows from the overhanging cliff. We continued the trail, stopped at other viewpoints, and I took maybe 40 more photos before we completed the loop and headed back to the visitor center. It was a good afternoon, exactly what I'd planned, and I didn't think anything more about it until that evening when I was reviewing the images on my laptop back at our hotel. I was going through them chronologically, doing basic edits, when I reached the photos from that particular dwelling, and I froze, because what I saw on screen wasn't what I'd seen through the viewfinder. The dwelling wasn't empty. There were 6 people inside it, standing in clear view, visible through the stone opening. They were positioned throughout the room, all facing outward toward my camera position, all perfectly still, all wearing modern clothing, jeans, fleece jackets, hiking boots. Not period costumes, not rangers in uniform, just ordinary people wearing ordinary clothes, standing inside a dwelling they weren't supposed to be able to access. I called my wife over and showed her the image. She remembered the dwelling, remembered standing there while I took the photos, and she was absolutely certain it had been empty. No one inside, no one visible, no activity at all. But the image showed 6 people, clear as day, all facing us, expressions completely blank, not smiling, or waving, or acknowledging the camera in any way. Just standing there. Staring. I checked the other photos from that stop. I'd taken 5 shots from slightly different angles, adjusting the composition. All 5 showed the same 6 people, in the same positions, same expressions, not moving between shots, not changing posture, just static, like they were mannequins positioned for display. But these weren't mannequins. You could see fabric texture, individual hair strands, the shadow detail on their faces. These were real people, photographed in real time. People who we didn't see with our own eyes, but who the camera captured perfectly. My wife suggested maybe they'd been there, and we just didn't notice them in the shadows, that the camera's exposure had brought out detail we missed visually. But that didn't make sense. The dwelling was roped off. There was no way to access it without climbing over barriers and stone walls. And even if someone had managed to get inside, we would have heard them, would have seen movement, would have noticed 6 people standing 15 feet away staring directly at us. I zoomed in on the faces, trying to identify any features that might explain what I was seeing. 2 of the people looked to be in their 30s, a man and a woman standing side by side near the back wall. 2 others looked younger, maybe mid-20s, positioned near the entrance, and 2 more stood in the shadows deeper in the alcove, partially obscured but clearly human in form and posture. All of them had that same blank expression, that same direct forward stare. And none of them showed any indication of life, no casual stance, no natural relaxation of muscles, nothing that suggested they were living people who just happened to be photographed. I started searching online for information about the dwelling, about whether there had been any strange reports from Walnut Canyon, any unexplained phenomena. Found nothing specific to that location, but I did find a Park Service contact email and sent a message describing what I'd captured. Attached the photos, explained exactly when they were taken, asked if they could provide any explanation. Got a response 2 days later from a ranger who said they'd reviewed the images and confirmed that no visitors or staff were inside that dwelling during our visit. The trail has security cameras at intervals, and they'd checked the footage from that afternoon. At the timestamp when I took my photos, the footage showed my family standing on the trail with me taking pictures, and the dwelling behind us was empty. No one inside, no one visible, no indication of any presence. The ranger asked if I could send the original files with metadata intact. I sent them over, and 3 days later I got another email, this time from someone who identified as being with the park's Historical Preservation Office. They said they'd had the images analyzed by their digital forensics contact, someone who examines photos for evidence of manipulation or alteration. The analysis confirmed the images were genuine, unmanipulated, with metadata showing they were taken with my camera at the stated time and location. No Photoshop, no editing, no digital insertion of figures. Whatever the camera captured was actually there when the shutter clicked. But then, the email said something that made my stomach turn. We'd like to request copies of any other photos you took that day, particularly if they show other dwelling locations. This isn't the first time we've received reports of this nature. I sent them everything from that day, all 63 photos from our visit. And 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the ranger I'd originally contacted. She asked if I'd be willing to come back to the park for a meeting, said there were things they wanted to show me that couldn't be sent via email. I was curious enough to make the drive back to Flagstaff, and I met her at the visitor center on a Tuesday morning when the park was closed for maintenance. She took me into a back office and spread out a series of photos across a table. Different cameras, different dates, different photographers, but all showing the same thing: people inside the cliff dwellings who shouldn't be there. She had maybe 30 photos total, dating back to 2015. All showing figures in modern clothing standing inside the ancient rooms. All with that same blank expression and direct stare. "We don't publicize this," she said. "Don't want to create panic or attract the wrong kind of attention. But it's been happening for at least 5 years that we know of. Probably longer. Different dwellings, different times of day, but the pattern is consistent. Photographers capture images of people inside the rooms, people who aren't visible to the naked eye, and who don't show up on our security footage." She showed me another photo, this one from a different photographer who'd visited in 2017. It showed one of the larger dwelling complexes with multiple rooms visible, and in each room stood figures, some alone, some in small groups, all facing the camera. All with that same unsettling stillness. She zoomed in on one of the faces and asked if I recognized the person. I didn't. She pulled up another photo, from a different location and different year, and pointed to a figure. Same person, same face, same expression, same clothing. "This man," she said, "appears in photos from 2017, 2018, and 2019. Different dwelling locations, different photographers, but it's the same individual. We ran facial recognition on him." She paused, pulled up a missing persons report on her computer. "He disappeared while hiking in Coconino National Forest in August 2017. Never found, presumed dead. But he's been photographed inside Walnut Canyon dwellings 6 times in the 2 years after his disappearance." I looked at the images she'd spread across the table and started recognizing faces. The woman from my photo, standing in the back of the dwelling she was in 3 other photos from different years. One of the younger men appeared in 5 different images. They weren't random people. They were the same individuals, photographed repeatedly over years, never aging, never changing position or expression, appearing in dwellings across the canyon. The ranger pulled up a database on her computer showing missing persons from Coconino National Forest over the past 15 years. She started clicking through profiles, showing me faces, and I recognized 4 of them from the photos on the table. 4 confirmed missing persons, all last seen hiking in the forest, all photographed repeatedly inside Walnut Canyon dwellings after they disappeared. "We don't know what it means," she said. "We don't know if they're really there in some way we can't perceive, or if the dwellings are somehow recording impressions of people who've been through the area. But whatever's happening, it's specific to the camera. Digital sensors capture it, film captures it, but human eyes don't see it. It's like there's a layer of reality that exists in the electromagnetic spectrum, but not in visible wavelengths." She asked me not to share what I'd learned publicly, said they were working with researchers to understand the phenomenon, but didn't want media attention or conspiracy theories derailing legitimate investigation. I agreed, left the park, and tried to process what I'd been told, but the images stayed with me, particularly the one of that man who disappeared in 2017. Because in the photo from my camera, he wasn't just standing there. If you looked carefully at his eyes, at the specific direction of his gaze, he was looking at something off to the side. And in the photo from 2018, taken by a different photographer from a different angle, he was looking in a different direction, tracking something moving outside the dwelling. He wasn't static. He was watching something. They all were. I went back to Walnut Canyon alone 3 months later, after the pandemic restrictions eased. Hiked the trail with my camera. Took photos of every dwelling I could access. Got home, reviewed the images, and found them in 16 different locations. The same 6 people from my original photo, plus others I didn't recognize. Maybe 20 people total, spread across the dwellings, all facing different directions now, all tracking movement along the trail paths. And in one photo, taken from the overlook above the canyon, I captured something I didn't see at the time. A figure standing on the trail behind where I'd been positioned, maybe 30 feet back, facing me. It was one of the people from the dwelling photos, the same woman in the fleece jacket, now outside the dwelling, standing on the public trail, staring directly at the camera. Staring at me, I checked the security footage through a FOIA request. At the timestamp when I took that photo, the footage showed me standing alone at the overlook. No one behind me, no one on the trail, just empty pathway and canyon walls. I haven't been back since then, but I monitor social media posts from Walnut Canyon, looking at photos other visitors share, and I see them in the backgrounds of selfies, in the edges of landscape shots, in the reflections on glass at the visitor center. The same faces, appearing in more and more photos, spreading beyond the dwellings and into the modern park infrastructure. Last week, someone posted a photo from the parking lot, taken at sunset, showing their car with the canyon in the background. And standing between cars, barely visible in the shadows, were 3 figures. I recognized them immediately. They're not staying in the dwellings anymore. The ranger called me yesterday, said they're closing Walnut Canyon temporarily for infrastructure maintenance. Asked if I'd been checking photos from other locations in Coconino Forest. I told her I had. She was quiet for a long moment. Then said, "They're spreading. We're finding them in photos from other parks, other trails. Always the same faces, same expressions. Whatever collected them is letting them move now." She asked if the woman from the parking lot photo looked familiar. I said yes. She said, "That's the photographer who took that photo. She posted it 3 days ago. We haven't been able to contact her since." I still have all my photos from Walnut Canyon. I've zoomed in on every face, studied every detail, and I've realized something that makes my hands shake when I think about it. They're not looking at the camera, they're looking through it, looking at whoever's behind the camera, studying faces, memorizing features. Because in the most recent photo I took, the woman in the fleece jacket isn't staring forward anymore. She's smiling, just slightly, like she's recognized something, like she's finally found what she's been looking for. And I think it might be me. I worked for the Forest Service for 15 years. Started as a field ranger in 2009, worked my way up to district coordinator, spent my days managing trails, coordinating search and rescue, filing incident reports, and maintaining the systems that keep Coconino National Forest operating safely. It's a good job, important work, and I believed in what we were doing, protecting wilderness, serving the public, maintaining balance between human recreation and natural preservation. But over the course of those 15 years, I started noticing patterns. Small things at first, inconsistencies in how certain incidents were handled, gaps in documentation that didn't make sense, protocols that existed only in verbal tradition rather than written policy. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized that beneath the official operations of the Forest Service, there was another layer, a set of procedures and responses that were never written down, never discussed openly, but that every senior ranger seemed to understand and follow without question. It started with disappearances. In my first year, a solo hiker went missing in the Fossil Springs area. Standard response should have been immediate search and rescue deployment, but I was told to wait 48 hours before initiating operations. When I questioned the delay, my supervisor said it was standard protocol for that area. I checked the official manual. No such protocol existed in writing. But when the search finally began 2 days later, we found the hiker alive, disoriented, with no memory of where he'd been, and everyone acted like this was normal, like we'd expected it. Over the years, I handled maybe 30 disappearance cases. And I noticed that certain areas had those unwritten protocols. Fossil Springs, 48-hour delay. West Clear Creek, 24-hour delay with specific search grid restrictions. Mogollon Rim Sector 7, immediate response, but avoid searching after sunset. These weren't in any manual, weren't part of any training, but every experienced ranger knew them and followed them without explanation. In 2016, I was promoted to a position that gave me access to older filing systems, archived reports going back to the 1970 seconds. I started digging, looking for when these protocols had been established and why. What I found disturbed me enough that I started keeping copies of documents at home, building a file of incidents that showed patterns the official narrative didn't acknowledge. Disappearances in Coconino Forest occur at a rate 37% higher than the national average for wilderness areas of comparable size and visitor traffic. But only about 60% of those disappearances are reported publicly. The others are filed under different classifications: voluntary departure, found safe with no incident, case closed due to insufficient evidence, even when the circumstances suggest something far more concerning. I found internal memos referencing acceptable loss rates for specific geographic zones, found budget allocations for monitoring equipment in remote areas with no explanation of what was being monitored or why, found incident reports with entire sections redacted in black marker, not by external agencies but by our own administrative staff. And I found casualty reports from the 1960 seconds that referenced cooperation agreements and non-interference zones, without specifying who the agreements were with or what non-interference meant. The breaking point came in 2019. A man disappeared from a trail near Mormon Lake. His family filed a missing persons report within 6 hours. Exactly what you're supposed to do. But when I pulled up the dispatch logs to coordinate the search, I saw that his report had been flagged with a code I didn't recognize. I asked my supervisor what the flag meant. He looked at the screen, then looked at me, and said, "Coordinate with special unit." "What special unit?" I asked. It wasn't in any organizational chart I'd ever seen. "They'll make contact," he said. "Don't initiate search until they clear it." I waited. 8 hours later, 2 people showed up at the ranger station in an unmarked vehicle. They didn't give names, didn't show identification beyond federal credentials, that didn't specify which agency. They asked for all documentation related to the missing hiker, asked about his last known location, asked if anyone had searched the area yet. I told them no. We'd been waiting for clearance. They said they'd handle it, that we should file a standard report indicating the hiker had left the area voluntarily and his case was closed. "But we haven't found him," I said. "His car is still at the trailhead. His family says he wouldn't just leave." "The case is closed," one of them repeated. "File the report." They left. I filed the report as directed because I wasn't sure what else to do. 3 days later, the hiker's family called saying he'd been found in Phoenix, claiming he'd simply changed his mind about the hike and caught a bus home. But when I spoke to him directly, trying to close the case properly, something was off. His voice was flat, his explanations were rehearsed, and when I asked specific questions about the trail he'd supposedly hiked, his answers didn't match the terrain. He was lying, or someone had told him what to say, or he genuinely didn't remember what had actually happened. I started asking questions, carefully, quietly, talking to rangers who'd been with the service for 25, 30 years. Most of them wouldn't discuss it. They'd change the subject, tell me to focus on my assigned duties, suggest that some things were better left unexamined. But one ranger, a man 3 weeks from retirement, agreed to meet me for coffee off-site. He told me that Coconino Forest has arrangements that predate the Forest Service itself. That when the forest was officially established in 1908, there were already monitoring operations in place, already agreements about which areas were off-limits and which incidents required special handling. He said that, in the 1950s and 60s, during the Cold War, multiple facilities were built in the forest, some official, some not, and that certain agencies conducted research in remote areas without public disclosure. Project Watchfire, he said. That's what they called it back then. They were monitoring something. I don't know what. But people disappeared. Observation teams didn't come back, and eventually they abandoned the facilities and established protocols instead. Rules about where we search, when we search, how we report what we find. I asked him if he knew what they were monitoring. He shook his head. I've seen enough to know it's still active, whatever it is. I've seen the lights over Strawberry Crater. I've read reports of encounters that get filed and then disappear from the database. I've coordinated with the special unit 12 times in my career. They always show up for specific types of incidents, usually disappearances that last exactly 48 hours, or cases where people are found with memory loss, or situations involving underground structures or unusual magnetic readings. He leaned forward and said, "The Forest Service isn't covering this up, we're managing it. There's something in this forest that's been here longer than we have. Something that takes people occasionally, something that operates in ways we don't understand. And someone, somewhere, made an agreement that we'd leave it alone as long as it stayed within certain parameters. Our job is to enforce those parameters, to make sure the public doesn't go looking in the wrong places, and to handle the aftermath when someone crosses a line they shouldn't have crossed." 2 weeks after that conversation, I submitted a formal report to my regional director, requesting clarification on unwritten protocols and asking for transparency regarding the Special Response Unit. I wanted official answers. I wanted documentation. I wanted to understand what I was actually managing. I was called into a meeting 3 days later. My supervisor was there, along with 2 people I'd never met who didn't introduce themselves. They asked me why I was pursuing this inquiry. I told them I needed to understand our operational procedures to do my job effectively. They told me that some procedures exist outside official documentation for operational security reasons, and that my need-to-know clearance didn't extend to those areas. I asked what would happen if I continued investigating. They were quiet for a moment, then one of them said, "Rangers who push this inquiry tend not to remain with the Forest Service. They find the work environment becomes uncomfortable. They develop conflicts with colleagues. They receive reassignments to undesirable locations. Eventually, they resign. We'd prefer not to see that happen to someone with your record." It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was a statement of fact. A description of what happens when rangers like me ask questions we're not supposed to ask. I could continue investigating and lose my career, or I could accept that there were layers of operation I wasn't cleared for and do my job within the boundaries I'd been given. I tried to accept it. Tried to go back to normal duties and stop asking questions, but I couldn't, because I'd started seeing the evidence myself: electronics failing in specific grid zones, wildlife evacuation patterns hours before disappearances occurred, seismic readings that matched industrial activity in areas with no human infrastructure. And I'd been called to enough recovery operations where people were found alive but changed gaps in memory, altered behavior, substances in their blood work that labs couldn't identify. In January 2024, I was coordinating a search for a solo hiker who'd been reported missing in the Peaks District. Standard operation, by the book response, no special flags or protocols. We found him 6 hours later, unconscious but alive, lying in a clearing about 3 miles from his last known position. Medical examination showed no injuries, no dehydration, no obvious cause for unconsciousness. But when he woke up in the hospital, he had a story. He said he'd been taken underground, said he'd been in a facility with bright lights, and people in protective suits. Said they'd examined him, taken samples, asked him questions he couldn't remember answering. He described it as feeling like a medical procedure, clinical and detached, performed by people who showed no emotion and communicated in voices that sounded wrong. When doctors asked him if he'd been drugged, he said no. He said he'd been awake the whole time, aware of everything happening, just unable to move or resist. I filed a report documenting his account. 2 days later, I was called into another meeting and told that the hiker had recanted his story. That he'd been confused from exhaustion and had imagined the experience. I asked to speak with him directly. They said he declined further interviews and wanted the case closed. I checked the hospital records. He'd been discharged the same day he'd told his story, signed himself out against medical advice, and left no contact information. I submitted my resignation 4 weeks later, told them I was pursuing other opportunities, thanked them for 15 years of employment, and walked away from a career I'd built from the ground up, because I couldn't be part of it anymore, couldn't file reports I knew were false, couldn't coordinate searches while following protocols designed to avoid finding certain things, couldn't pretend that the forest I was managing was just wilderness and trails and natural hazards. Before I left, I copied every document I could access: incident reports, internal memos, budget allocations, correspondence with unnamed agencies. I've been organizing them for months, cross-referencing cases, building a timeline of events that shows the pattern clearly. 37 years of coordinated incidents, hundreds of disappearances with consistent characteristics, evidence of ongoing monitoring by agencies that don't officially exist, and protocols that ensure the public never understands what's operating in the spaces between the trails. 3 other rangers have resigned in the past 6 months. 2 from my district, 1 from Red Rock. All of them with 15+ years of experience. All of them refusing to explain why they left. I've reached out to them. 1 won't respond. 1 told me to stop contacting him. The 3rd agreed to talk, and what he said confirmed everything I'd been documenting. He said, "There's an agreement. We don't know the full terms. We don't know who negotiated it or when. But it's real, and it's being enforced by people with authority that supersedes the Forest Service. Our job was never to protect the public from the forest. It was to protect the forest's secrets from the public. I'm going public with this now because I don't have anything left to lose. No career to protect, no pension to preserve, no reason to stay silent. Something is operating in Coconino National Forest. Something that requires acceptable loss rates and non-interference protocols. Something that has agreements with agencies that don't appear on organizational charts. Something that takes people, examines them, and returns them changed in ways we're not allowed to investigate." Last week, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. No words, just 2 minutes of silence, and then a sound. I recognized the grinding, mechanical noise from deep underground that appeared in reports from Sycamore Canyon. The message was clear. They know I have the documents. They know I'm talking, and they're reminding me that they're still watching. But here's what they don't understand. I'm not afraid anymore. Because I've spent 15 years watching people disappear and being forced to file false reports. I've watched families search for answers and been ordered to give them lies. I've coordinated operations designed to avoid discovering the truth. And I can't do it anymore. So I'm telling you directly, if you hike in Coconino National Forest, understand that you're not just entering wilderness. You're entering territory that operates under rules we don't fully understand, managed by forces we're not allowed to question. Stay on marked trails. Don't investigate unusual structures. Don't go alone into areas where electronics fail. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, lights that move in patterns, people who appear and disappear, sounds that don't match any natural source, leave immediately and don't report it to the Forest Service. Because the people who will respond aren't there to help you. They're there to make sure whatever you saw stays hidden. And if you push too hard to understand what happened, you'll join the list of rangers who left suddenly, the hikers who voluntarily departed, the cases that closed with insufficient evidence. The forest has been here for millions of years. The agencies monitoring it have been here for decades, and whatever they made an agreement with has been here longer than both. We're just walking through their territory, hoping we don't see too much, hoping we don't ask too many questions. I hope this reaches you before they suppress it, and I hope you understand. Some things have been here first. And they're not leaving.